From the Amazon to the Andes, Mexico is home to more than 2,500 species of orchids. But one orchid stands out from the rest. It's known as the hypnotic flower because once an orchid bee lands on it, it goes crazy. So what makes this flower so special? Let's find out. Deep in the jungles of southern Mexico lies an ancient Mayan archaeological site. It's called El Peru, and it means the place where the orchids grow. That's because the entire site is covered in these beautiful flowers. And no two orchids are alike. Their petals come in every color imaginable, except blue. Some even glow at night like tiny green lanterns. But it's not the looks that make them so famous. It's their smell. You see, orchids release a special perfume into the jungle. And when orchid bees fly by, they can't help but get addicted to it. They have to land on these flowers and drink their sweet nectar. Now, there's one problem. There are hundreds of different types of orchids and hundreds of different kinds of bees. But only a few orchids release the right perfume to attract the bees they need. Otherwise, the bees would simply move on to another flower. The good news is that scientists have recently discovered why this happens and how it helps plants make more plants. But first, we need to meet our favorite bee, the orchid bee. Orchid bees are fuzzy, round and black with yellow stripes. They're also huge, reaching up to half an inch in length. And they're not your typical bees because they don't live in hives and they don't make honey. Instead, they spend all their time searching for orchids to pollinate. Now, there's a reason for this. See, orchid bees collect pollen from flower to flower, and when they do, some of the pollen sticks to their furry bodies. Then when they fly off to find another orchid, the pollen falls off them and lands on the next flower. This accidentally pollinates the plant, allowing it to make seeds and more flowers. That's why all orchids produce a sweet-smelling perfume. It attracts these special bees to come and drink their nectar and pollinate their plants. But some orchids are more clever than others. You see, while most flowers can only be pollinated by bees, these ones can be pollinated by beetles, ants, and even hummingbirds. And that's why they make sure their perfume only attracts certain types of bees. Take our friends here. These two different types of orchids only open at night. That way they can catch the attention of nocturnal pollinators like bats and moths. And their perfume is strong enough to lure in these special pollinators from miles away. Of course, this doesn't always work. Sometimes animals still prefer the flowers of other plants. That's why these orchids have a backup plan. You see, some flowers can't rely on animals to pollinate them, so instead, they use the wind. Take a look at these. They have long, thin stems and floppy petals. That way they can sway in the breeze and easily drop their pollen into the water below. And then the water carries their pollen to other flowers, allowing them to grow. But it's hard to be so light and floppy. That's why most orchids need something to hold them up, like this vine. When they're little seedlings, they climb onto a tree or a leaf and use the structure to support them as they grow. And by the time they're adults, they've turned into beautiful flowers. But the best part is that they leave little presents for the trees that help them grow. You see, deep inside their trunks, there's a sticky substance called sap. And when the sap reaches the leaves, it turns into a sugary treat. The leaves end up tasting delicious, which attracts even more pollinators to the forest. But while all these adaptations are amazing, none of them compare to the hypnotic flower. You see, this flower has a trick that allows it to hypnotize orchid bees and control their minds. In order to understand how this works, we need to look at this flower from above. See, it grows on a tall tree, far out of reach from most animals. That's why when it needs to spread its pollen, it relies on the wind. But there's a problem. If it releases its pollen into the air, it'll fall down onto the leaves below. And if it lands on the wrong type of leaf, it won't find another flower to pollinate. That's why this flower has long, thin petals. They act like a slide for the pollen to go down. But that's not all. When the pollen reaches the end of the slide, it lands on a special part of the flower called the rostellum. And this is where the magic happens. You see, the rostellum is sticky, and it holds the pollen until something very special happens. A bee has to crawl through this tight hole and cover itself in pollen. But that's not easy. See, it's not very big. In fact, it's exactly the size of an orchid bee. And that's no coincidence. You see, this flower has a secret weapon, a tiny trigger that sprays pollen onto anything that crawls through. In other words, this flower can turn any bee into an orchid bee, whether they want to or not. But why? Well, it's all about survival. You see, in order to survive, this flower needs to spread its pollen as fast as possible. And it does that by turning bees into orchid bees. When a bee crawls through the tunnel, it becomes covered in pollen. Then when it flies off to find another flower, the pollen rubs off on the next plant. This allows this flower to spread its pollen quickly and efficiently, all thanks to its hypnotic powers. Now, you might be wondering what happens to the bee after it's been hypnotized. Does it become an orchid bee forever? The answer is no. See, when bees collect pollen, they store it in a special pouch on their legs. They use it later to make more bees. But this flower has a special trick to remove the pollen whenever it wants. All it has to do is spray a tiny bit of acid onto the bee. Then the pollen slides right off. Now the bee is free to collect pollen from other flowers. So what's the real secret behind the hypnotic flower? It's not its perfume, its size, or its shape. It's actually this little trigger inside its petals. It allows the flower to control the bees that pollinate them, making them the ultimate flower in the jungle. But don't forget, the jungle is full of surprises. While these flowers are hypnotizing bees, these others are luring in ants. Click here to learn more.